Hello, and welcome to another episode of Life Telos' First Principle. Today I want to talk about consciousness. What is it? How did it come to be? And where is it located? Maybe you haven't felt a need to ask any of these questions and you're happy to just take consciousness for granted and get on with living your life. What difference could the answer to these questions make? Well, maybe more than you think. I invite you to take a moment now just to notice that you are conscious. This might be the most fundamental part of your very existence. You're aware of your body, the environment around you, what I'm saying, your internal thoughts and feelings, and the implicit sense that you exist. Frankly, it would be odd if you had never even been slightly curious about how this became possible. Of course you have. But how far have you pursued the question? Have you really thought about it, or instead accepted conventional explanations? For instance, that consciousness is somehow an emergent property or epiphenomenon of the brain, and that's where it's located, and that's that. What if there are other ways to understand it? Ways that could transform your entire view and experience of yourself and the world around you? That's what I want to talk about today. If that sounds not only interesting, but potentially life-changing, then stick with me for the whole video. I've been thinking about this for decades. In fact, it all began when I had a profound transformative experience at the age of 19. The only way I had to describe it then was that I felt at one with everything. At some point, I had a deep intuition that it had to do with consciousness. What I am about to tell you is what my curious thinking mind has come up with in the intervening years to make some sense of the experience. It's not the experience itself or how to evoke it. That's a whole other topic. What I'm doing today is just pointing in that direction. Anyway, the other night, going to bed and unable to sleep, a particular question pestered my mind and kept me up for a few more hours. Where is consciousness located? Aside from answering the question of what consciousness even is and how it came to be, where the heck is it? The next day, this question persisted, consumed my day, and demanded some sort of answer. It wasn't the first time I had wondered about this, but my wondering wasn't done with me. I recalled the basics of everything I've thought about this for the last 50 years. I wrote it all down as much as I could. I started all over with the first usual argument, as mentioned, that it somehow resides in the brain, yet exactly where in the brain is never and never will be determined. It's understood as arising from complex systems and networks of neuronal connections. So, consciousness is located not at a specific site, but within a system of interacting parts. Okay. Then the question arises, why should the brain be treated as a closed system? It most definitely is not. It would not have evolved, as nothing could evolve, as a closed system. It's a product of, embedded in, and responsive to its environment, receiving sensory stimuli of multiple kinds, generating sensations and impulses, and ultimately behaviors that are meant to interact with the environment. It's a system within systems. To conclude that it is a systemic phenomenon and to locate it within the skull is an arbitrary constriction. In reality, the human brain is a node within multiple hierarchically arranged systems extending outward to the physical environment, the social and cultural context, even the solar system and beyond to the universe itself. It seems irrefutably true. And if so, where then do we locate consciousness? If it's not only in the brain, is it also in the universe? What are the implications of that? If the brain is a conscious system of interactions, is the universe conscious too? And if the universe is conscious, what might it be like to be the universe? Let's hold that question for now and get back to it later. Beyond philosophical curiosity and fascination with its intersection with science, what difference does it make to our lives if we understand what consciousness is or where it is. Most people carry unexamined beliefs about consciousness or never think about it at all, and the result can be a sense of being an alienated, insignificant speck of fragile and mortal stuff, and somehow aware of this in an otherwise mechanistic and meaningless universe. Maybe this isn't always right on the surface of our consciousness, but it lurks underneath, a scary and dangerous hole we must somehow try not to think about. Whether provable or not, life feels different if we imagine that our very consciousness, the most fundamental aspect of what we are, is not only connected to, but made of and embedded in conscious stuff. When we look down to the microscopic parts of our bodies or up into the night sky and sense ourselves as seamlessly part of everything, not just in matter, but in mind, it feels like something. This might be an interesting or even exciting way to think, but its true transformative power comes from a direct felt experience of it. It delivers an experience of belonging at the deepest existential level. It doesn't cure all anxiety or make life suddenly easy, but it is grounding and orienting in the most profound sense. Each moment of conscious existence, regardless of the content of awareness, is felt as sacred, as if it's meant to be. We will forget, we'll lose touch with this, but once seen and experienced, we can return to it when we feel lost. Shortly, I'll introduce two of the main frameworks that have emerged in modern philosophy of mind to describe consciousness beyond the human skull. But before I do this, I want to more fully deal with the idea that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain. What exactly does this mean? In modern neuroscience, it's often described as a kind of harmless side effect of neural activity. Like steam rising from a boiling pot, the brain does all the causal work, and consciousness merely rides along. It's the picture of a train and a train whistle. The engine moves the train, and the whistle is simply produced by it. It doesn't do anything. It can't influence the movement. This is a neat way of thinking. It fits well with the old Newtonian view of the universe that many of us still carry around implicitly. In Newton's world, space and time are passive. They're a kind of empty container or stage where the real action happens. Forces push and pull, matter moves and interacts, and space and time simply sit there, unaffected. They provide the backdrop, but have no part in the play. But of course, that view eventually gave way. Einstein showed that space and time are not passive at all. They participate. Space-time bends and curves. It shapes the movement of planets and light. In return, matter shapes its curvature. The supposedly inert container turned out to be an active part of the process. Reality wasn't a set of objects sitting in a box. It was a dynamic relationship between matter, energy, and the very fabric of space-time. This shift was revolutionary, and I sometimes wonder if something similar needs to happen in how we think about consciousness. When we call consciousness an epiphenomenon, we treat it as if it were Newton's space, a passive arena in which thoughts and sensations simply appear. But what if that's wrong? What if consciousness is not a neutral background, but a dynamic field shaped by the biological processes that give rise to it, and in turn shaping how those processes unfold? Not by pushing neurons around as if it were some kind of ghostly force, but by organizing information, highlighting meaning, guiding attention, and orienting behavior. These aren't mechanical pushes and pulls. They're relational processes. They're ways that life interprets itself and responds to its own states. And I'm not the only one who finds this line of thought compelling. Alfred North Whitehead argued that treating consciousness as a passive shadow fails to recognize that experience is woven into the dynamic fabric of reality itself. Francisco Varela and Evan Thompson, in their inactive approach to the mind, describe consciousness as an active, self-organizing process that arises from the living body's ongoing engagement with its world. And David Chalmers suggested that consciousness may play a structural role in how information becomes integrated, rather than being an inert add-on. Even Roger Penrose, coming from physics, has speculated about deep connections between consciousness and the geometry of space-time, not as a mystical claim, but as a recognition that our old categories may not be adequate. None of this means consciousness is a physical force like gravity. The point is subtler. It may be that consciousness is to the processes of life what curvature is to space-time. Not something that pushes on matter from the outside, but the way the system organizes itself from within, a dynamic interiority rather than a passive residue. Seen in this way, consciousness is not the whistle on the train, but the felt shape of the track itself, the way experience bends, curves, and orients us moment by moment toward what matters, not epiphenomenal, but intrinsic to life's ongoing attempt to make sense of itself, to move toward coherence, and to participate in the world it belongs to. Okay, let's move on to two other perspectives on consciousness beyond the human skull. First, panpsychism proposes that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality itself, that every particle or process possesses at least a tiny glimmer of interiority or experience. The second is cosmopsychism, which by contrast suggests that consciousness is not many sparks, but one vast field, the universe itself as a single self-knowing whole, with individual minds as localized expressions of it. Each view is supported by complex arguments I won't unpack here, but in brief, panpsychists reason upward from the difficulty of explaining how consciousness could emerge from wholly unconscious matter, while cosmopsychists reason downward from the unity of experience itself, asking whether that unity reflects an underlying universal mind. My purpose here is to explore what their combined intuitions might suggest about how we understand consciousness. It's striking to me that most of the philosophers who have ventured into panpsychism or cosmopsychism rarely speak of what may have drawn them there in the first place. Behind their formal arguments, I imagine that, like me, they sense that discovering what consciousness truly is and where it belongs could transform not only our theories, but our experience of life. Yet in print, this intuition is almost never acknowledged. The analytic tradition treats existential or emotional implications as some kind of contamination. To speak of meaning, reverence, or healing risks sounding spiritual or new age or therapeutic, and therefore unfit for the sober discourse of metaphysics. But if consciousness is not confined to the skull, if it's continuous with life and cosmos, the implication is not merely intellectual. It is existential. It changes what it feels like to be human. When consciousness is imagined as a private flicker inside an isolated head, we experience alienation. When it's continuous with the living world and the vastness of the universe, the sense of exile softens. Our awareness feels like a deep connection with and participation in all that we perceive, and less as a lonely subject gazing upon mere objects. This shift is not just comforting, it's regulative. It orients behavior. A worldview of belonging encourages stewardship, cooperation, curiosity, and humility. It quiets the nervous system and makes aggression harder to sustain. In that sense, cosmopsychism is not only a metaphysical hypothesis, it's a kind of therapy, if you want to call it that, for civilization. It's at the root of what I mean by Life Telos as first principle. In my own thinking, over the years, I've leaned toward panpsychism to understand consciousness. Starting at the level of atoms or even subatomic particles, we might recognize proto-consciousness or very primitive forms of interiority. In the past, I've defined consciousness as the capacity to respond to stimuli. While reasonable, this doesn't address the subjective experience we associate with consciousness. What needs to be added is that simultaneously with responsiveness to stimuli, at least at the level of biological organisms, comes the interior experience of sensation and impulse. Early on, this is not self-reflexive. It boils down to sensations of pain and pleasure and impulses to move toward or away from stimulus. It's not organized around a consciousness of self, but it is still subjective experience. Of course, there's no way to know what a single cell experiences. But by the same token, there's no way to know exactly what any other person's subjective experience is. For anything beyond our own first-person awareness, from atoms to cells to animals to other humans to the universe, we must rely on inference and imagination. This is called theory of mind or mentalization. To mentalize about anything else requires a special imaginative effort. The first mistake is to avoid anthropomorphism, projecting our own human experience onto non-human creatures and things. Between humans, true empathy means not projecting our own experiences onto others, thinking that they experience exactly what we would in the same circumstances. We must speculate only on what is similar between ourselves and others and try to imagine anything beyond that. At the level of a cell, we can imagine sensation and impulse corresponding to stimulus and response. And we can walk our way up the animal kingdom and form plausible mentalizations. When a dog hides under a bed because of fireworks on the 4th of July or New Year's Eve, he probably experiences fear and the impulse to flee. A butterfly, too, likely feels something like fear when it darts from a swiping hand. The experience differs, but there is something it is like to be conscious and respond to stimuli. So far, so good for panpsychism, but what about at the level of the universe, or cosmopsychism? Here, my earlier definition, consciousness is the capacity to respond to stimuli, seems to fail. There's nothing outside the universe to serve as a stimulus, nothing to move toward or away from. What possible point of similarity can we identify to mentalize about the consciousness of the universe? Even proponents of cosmopsychism draw a blank here. Several acknowledge this problem, but have little more to say about it. Is this a fatal flaw? Does this mean it can't exist? But perhaps the impossibility isn't absolute after all. Even within our own experience, consciousness doesn't depend entirely on external stimuli. We dream, imagine, remember, and hallucinate. Our nervous systems can generate sensations, images, and emotions with no sensory input at all external to us. These internally generated experiences arise from the brain's recursive loops, where perception feeds back into itself. They are not pure fabrications. They're built from the raw material of our encounters with the external world, reorganized and recombined into new patterns of feeling and form. So, perhaps, our own awareness of internally generated stimuli provides some point of similarity for mentalizing about the consciousness of the universe. If we use that as an analogy, then the absence of an outside for the universe may not mean the absence of stimulus. The cosmos is not a static block, but a field of ceaseless internal differentiations, galaxies colliding, stars igniting, organisms evolving, consciousness reflecting upon itself. These are not external provocations, but internal dynamics, the universe stimulating itself through the play of its own parts. In that sense, the thoughts or dreams of the cosmos, if such language can be used, would be the relational movements of its own becoming, the continual self-stimulation of a whole that can never step outside itself to know what it is, yet endlessly feels itself from within. Another way to think about this is to recognize that the body cannot know itself except through its cells, and its cells know nothing of the body. In this metaphor, we are the cells in the body of the universe. Maybe it is only conscious through us and its other conscious parts, and yet we cannot know its consciousness. This may be an eternal impasse We may learn new things, but this might be a mystery that will never be solved. We might consider mystical traditions that offer practices for attaining cosmic consciousness. This is what it looks and feels like to identify with the cosmos, to feel at one with it. But this remains an earthly, biologically mediated experience. Maybe we glimpse something, but can we say that this is the first-person perspective of the cosmos itself? Perhaps even the notion of a first, second, and third-person perspective is just the way our consciousness is structured, and we are merely projecting that onto the universe. At the same time, that's all we've got. Maybe at the cosmic level, our own structure is just a component of some larger, more complex form of consciousness. And yet, just maybe, cells have some kind of proto-intuitive feeling that something's going on up there. Within consciousness studies, the debate between panpsychism and cosmopsychism is framed as a choice. Does consciousness arise from the myriad parts of matter, or do the parts emerge within one universal mind? Panpsychism looks upward. Cosmopsychism looks downward. One faces the combination problem, how many little consciousnesses combine into one larger one. The other faces the decomposition problem, how one cosmic consciousness divides into many finite ones. The two theories thus mirror each other. Each solves the other's riddle only to create its own. One cannot explain unity, the other cannot explain multiplicity. Perhaps the opposition is false. A handful of thinkers, Whitehead, William James, Teilhard de Chardin, and C.S. Peirce, hinted that these are not rival accounts, but complementary poles of one living process. Whitehead captured it in the phrase, "The many become one and are increased by one." Each act of perception gathers a diversity of impressions into a single coherent experience. The many become one, and that unified experience then enters the stream of reality as one more element among the many, available to be integrated again at a higher level. In this way, consciousness is not a static property, but a continual folding and unfolding of unity and multiplicity, integration and renewal. A useful image is the Rubin vase. When you see the faces, you perceive consciousness as distributed among parts, panpsychism. When you see the vase, you perceive consciousness as a single whole, cosmopsychism. The picture doesn't change, only the figure-ground relation shifts. This dialectic mirrors the rhythm of life itself, differentiation and integration, autonomy and communion, analysis and feeling. The polarity between pan and cosmopsychism is life's own rhythm, the universe thinking and feeling through us, trying to know itself as both many and one. For many raised in a mechanistic worldview, the first great shift comes not from philosophy, but from wonder. We begin to see and feel that our bodies and brains are products of the same processes that form stars and forests. We stop feeling like alienated strangers and recognize that we are nature, looking at itself. This at least makes us feel connected to everything. But the universe still appears as a magnificent stage on which awareness happens to emerge, not as a participation in awareness itself. Gratitude and awe arise, but not yet intimacy. The next step is to move from belonging to the universe to realizing that it is consciousness all the way up and all the way down. The very fabric of the universe at all levels is responsive and participatory. The miracle of being conscious is no longer a private accident. It's the cosmos recognizing itself through us. There's a related field of study that can help us unpack this further. If we look closely, life is not only mechanical, but communicative. Every living thing, from a bacterium to a human, exists within networks of signals and responses. The field of biosemiotics studies this language of life, the recognition that biology is, at every level, a semiotic system. A single cell does not simply react to its environment in a blind mechanical way. It interprets chemical cues, distinguishing nourishment from toxin, self from other. The interpretation may be primitive, but it is still interpretation. DNA is itself a language or code that life reads in order to assemble itself with staggering complexity and precision. Meaning is not an invention of the human mind, but an intrinsic feature of life. Human consciousness is not an inexplicable leap from matter to mind, but a deepening of semiotic capacity. To live is to signify, to evolve is to deepen the conversation. I think biosemiotics is relevant for existentialism, which arose as a response to the modern experience of meaninglessness, the loss of any given framework of value after the decline of religion and the rise of scientific materialism. It recognized that if meaning is not handed down from above, it must be created from within. But existentialism itself is a product of the same abstraction that created the meaning void. It imagines that meaning must be found in lofty abstract ideas and doesn't see it right under its nose. When reason dissociates from life, it mistakes the resulting absence of meaning for the intrinsic meaninglessness of life. Biosemiotics offers a different lens. Meaning did not arrive with humans, it is woven into life itself. Every organism interprets signs, distinguishes friend from foe, nourishment from poison, self from other. To live is already to make sense of a meaningful world. Seen in this way, existential despair is not a revelation of the universe's cold indifference, but a symptom of disconnection. Meaning was never absent. We merely abstracted ourselves from the living systems through which meaning flows. We're not meaning makers adrift in a meaningless world. We're meaning deepeners within a cosmos already alive with meaningful signs. While most panpsychists stop at experience, and most biosemioticians stop at signification, the two together reveal complementary sides of the same living process. Panpsychism tells us that every level of reality has an inside, a qualitative feel, however primitive, while biosemiotics shows that every living system also has an outside, a pattern of sign relations through which that interiority expresses itself. The outside here does not mean something separate, but the relational face of experience, how feeling becomes form, how interior states become communicative acts in the world. One describes the subjective continuity of experience, the other the objective continuity of meaning. Brought into dialogue, they suggest that consciousness and meaning are not separate phenomena, but the interior and exterior expressions of life's telos itself, the drive toward ever more complex forms of self-relation, communication, and participation in the whole. Perhaps the task isn't to solve the puzzle of consciousness, but to participate in it more fully, to live as if our awareness were life itself, reflecting on its own coherence. We will and must think and act, and whatever we think or do will inevitably be imperfect and incomplete. Nevertheless, we should think and act as well as we possibly can. Any other way is inferior. Maybe consciousness, like logic and Gödel's theorem, cannot fully prove its own consistency. Perhaps it can only reveal its truth by its fruits, by the coherence, compassion, and vitality it produces in the worlds we inhabit, our physical and psychological health, our social cohesion and collaboration, our infrastructure and ecologies. We are one of the ways the universe becomes aware of its own unfolding. To know that is not to escape mystery, but to dwell within it consciously, with humility, wonder, and care. In conclusion, I want to put a fine point on what I mean when I say that Life Telos is rooted in biology. I don't mean biology as a closed system of mechanisms. I mean biology as the study of living processes, of matter that feels, interprets, and acts. In that sense, consciousness is not something biology produces, but a dimension it already contains. One could as easily say that biology is the visible expression of consciousness, as that consciousness is the interior aspect of biology. To ground life telos in biology, then, is not to reduce it to chemistry. It is to recognize life itself as the meeting point between matter and mind. Well, I think I've said enough. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. Whether or not you agree with what I've said, I do hope that I've given you some new ways to reflect on your own consciousness and the sense that it matters how you view it. It's not just an indulgent philosophical preoccupation, but potentially a life-changing inquiry. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.